So if everyone could just take their seats and start to settle down, the event's going to begin right now. So, hello everyone. Hi. Hello, my name is Nicole Smith, preferably Nikki. My pronouns are they, them, their, themselves. I'm a junior in NYU in CAS, and my major is global public health and anthropology. And I'm going to pass the mic to my co-performer.
All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Deshaun Gordon King. My pronouns are he, his, himself, hisself. I'm a first-year master's student at Steinhardt studying instrumental performance in the flute.
All right.
And
That's what I'm asking.
the program tonight, we're going to play His Eye is on the Sparrow.
That's God.
Yeah, right.
And one more note, in the back, Carol, could you wave your hand? Carol is going to be taking photos for this event, so if you don't want to be photographed, just let her know and we will just crop you up and put Beyonce over your face. Okay? Thank you.
Welcome. Hi. Hi. Again, hi. Hi. I am so excited that you are all here, and I want to hear another round of applause. Deshaun and Nikki, thank you for representing us. So welcome to the NYU LGBTQ Student Center and the Center for Multicultural Education and Programs event, Do All Black Lives Matter. We have an exciting panel coming ahead. We're going to be talking about some generally heavy topics today. And we want to take care of each other. We want to support each other throughout the discussion. This is why we didn't want it to be like, boom, heavy topic, you know? We just wanted to start with the conversation, with a little bit of music, and just to like ease us into what we're gonna be talking about. Throughout the PowerPoint, you're gonna see some hashtags, and you're gonna have the information where you can tweet. And the people who are gonna be at the panel, feel free to do so throughout the discussion today. It helps the people who are not able to be here to also be with us and understand what's happening, right? So please do feel free to like, we're not gonna be like, you're not paying attention, you're on your phones. No. We want you to pay attention and be on your phone. And we're gonna acknowledge the sponsors a little later. As I said, this is an event put together by NYU LGBTQ Center and the Center for Multicultural Education and Programs, as well as we also receive funding from the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality and the African American Affairs Institute. So give it up for those two other co-sponsors. And before we move forward, I don't want to pass the opportunity to acknowledge our fierce coordinator of this evening today, Charlie Ferlusi. Charlie has done everything for tonight. So everything that is happening today, Charlie has planned and put a lot of love into this program. So thank you for your contributions, Charlie. And without further ado, I want to bring Dee, who's one of our graduate students, who's going to provide us some words of reflection to start the evening today.
Before we get started, I don't know if many of you heard, we lost another sister this week in Louisiana, I believe. Her name is Penny. So if we could just take a moment for her. Black Lives Matter, Trans Lives Matter. Sometimes the fact that these are revolutionary statements still is disheartening. The fact that even in the safety of the queer community, trans people of color are sidelined and silenced and told they literally storm the stage. This fact is disheartening. But you're all here. So at the very least you understand that these statements are true. Black trans lives matter. What we're here to do tonight is first and foremost, listen to the people doing the heavy lifting in this movement. Listen. These are the people who have taken the stage and the mic when everything conspired to keep them away. These are the people whose love for self and community has quite literally disrupted the wheels of power. So let's listen, and then let's engage and find out how to move from mere understanding to daily embodiment. Black lives matter. Trans lives matter. Black trans lives matter. Little background. The Trans Women of Color Collective is an amazing national organizing collective created in September 2013 in New York City after the brutal murder of Islan Nettles. Trans Women of Color Collective works to uplift the lived narratives, experiences, and leadership of trans people of color by centering healing, restoration, fellowship, and action in social justice movements. The voices of those most disproportionately impacted by structural oppression must be elevated to create revolutionary change. The Trans Women of Color Collective has set the tone for trans people of color to step into their leadership by leading courageous conversations that challenge and work to dismantle white supremacist, heteronormative, cis patriarchy, and the erasure of trans women of color in leadership.
Woohoo! Okay. You sing. You know doggy for this. Get up.
Black Lives Matter is both a social media movement and a call to action. Created by Alicia Garza, Opal Ayo, and Patrice Marie Cullors in the wake of Trayvon Martin's murder, Black Lives Matter is an affirmation and embrace of the resistance and resilience of Black people. It was founded by and for queer Black folk and deliberately centers Black liberation on the hyper-marginalized, queer and trans, undocumented, disabled, incarcerated, and surveilled women and all Black lives along the gender spectrum. Much respect for that.
Woo-hoo.
And just to close out with more remarks, please, or not. I'm going to read a poem that was written by Jericho Brown. He's pretty awesome. And it is called Psalm 150, but I promise I'm not going there right now.
Okay.
Some folks fool themselves into believing, but I know what I know once. At the height of hope is touching. My man and I hold our breaths, certain we can stop time or maybe eliminate it from our lives, which are shorter, since we learn to make love for each other rather than doing it to each other. As for praise and worship, I prefer the latter. Only memory makes us kneel, silent and still. Hear me? Thunder scares. Lightning lets us see. Then, heads covered, we wait for rain. Dear Lord, let me watch for his arrival and hang my head and shake it like a man who's lost and lived. Something keeps trying, but I'm not killed yet.
Hello? Oh. God. Okay. Thank you very much. So right now I'm going to introduce an amazing person I had the pleasure of meeting just about 20 minutes ago. So what does solidarity look like? What will our collective healing look like? It is time that we have courageous conversations in our community that acknowledges the complicity and lack of action and response for Black trans lives. For our collective liberation, it is imperative that we acknowledge how structural oppression manifests in all of our lives. In order to begin to heal and work in tandem to dismantle oppressive systems whose sole purpose is to destroy us and have us destroy each other, We must acknowledge and affirm our truths. An act of violence is against one of us is an act of violence against all of us. Healer, orator, and revolutionary freedom fighter Lourdes Ashley Hunter. A co-founder and national director of Trans Women of Color Collective, which recently launched its national headquarters in partnership with Casa Ruby LGBT Multicultural Center in Washington, D.C. Lourdes' pronouns are goddess, queen, sister. Goddess is the Chief Communications Officer for the DC LGBT Center and a member of Black Lives Matter leadership team. Lourdes earned a bachelor's degree in social theory, structure, and change with concentrations in race, class, and gender from SUNY Empire State College, and a master's in public administration from Rutgers School of Public Affairs and Administration. You can join Goddess Queen Sister on Twitter at Hunter Lourdes and TWOCC at TWOCC NYC. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Lourdes.
Okay, great. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Oh, hey. It's always a pleasure to be back in NYC. I've lived here for 12 years, and it's an amazing experience. Trans Women of Color Collective started in NYC, and so it's always a pleasure to be back here with the community, and it's a pleasure to be here at NYU. And thank Charlie so much for this amazing work. I'm kind of blocked in, I don't know what's going on. Thanks, Stephanie.
Sorry. Also, there's seating around if y'all need it. If anyone want to raise their hand, there's a seat next to you.
Yes, if you are a Black trans woman, person of color, queer, gender person of color, please come to the front.
Ashe.
Yes, please, the seating. They're giving me work. Oh my God, I thought I had to do show up. So I'm glad to be here, and I'm going to introduce some amazing panelists who are here to join me and I've had the pleasure of working with. So first we're going to introduce Brother Darnell Moore, who is a writer and educator. He is also the co-managing editor of the Feminist Wire. He also teaches in the Africana Studies Department at Vassar College. He co-organized the Black Lives Matter Ride to Ferguson along with BLM co-creator Patrice Cullors. Let's welcome Brother Darnell. Producer, host of the Kitty Bella Show. Modern Queen Sister Katrina. Celebrated NYC. There's really trouble growing up, including transphobic attacks and violence. Katrina overcame some of her oppression and graduated college in 2005 and has worked in government civil service for over a decade. Katrina is navigating from inside the system and creating platforms outside of it. Katrina created the empowerment campaign T-Girls Rock in 2013 to raise visibility and empower trans folk of color through clothing. Katrina is the co-founder of Trans Women of Color Collective and is also part of the leadership team. You can follow her at tweet Trina, the number 4, LYFE. Give Trina a round of applause. Next, I'm going to introduce Brother Ahmad Greene Hayes. He is a freelance writer and scholar activist working with Black Lives Matter and a number of other community networks against police brutality, sexual violence, and state-sanctioned terror. His writings have been featured previously on the Feminist Wire and other sites. He is also the lead organizer of the weekly Twitter chatter, Ferguson Fridays. Follow him at _BROTAG. Let's welcome Ahmad Greene. Next, let's welcome Brother T. Malone. He is a writer, advocate, and spokesperson for GLAD, the leading LGBTQ organization. He was featured in the national media campaign for Live Out Loud. Yeah. Right. He is also the co-chair of the LGBT task force for the National Association of Black Journalists. He has done on-air interviews. He has done on-air interviews for CNN, BlackEnterprise.com, Al Jazeera America, MTV, HuffPost, and MSNBC. He has written articles for BET.com, Rolling Stone, New York Times, and The Source, Vibe, and others on issues facing the LGBT movement. He has been featured as a Black LGBT leader on Ebony.com and BET.com. TWOCC is the former editor-in-chief of Icons magazine, an LGBT pop culture magazine, and has been a freelance pop culture journalist for several years, interviewing people like Jay-Z and Tyson. He documented his transition in films Due People and Realness. Welcome, T. Malone. Lastly, and certainly not least, Goddess, Queen, Sister, Elle Hearn. Elle is from Columbus, Ohio. She is also part of the leadership team of Trans Women of Color Collective, and she is also the Central Regional Coordinator for Get Equal. Elle's work is centered around the pursuit of liberation for marginalized voices with an extreme focus on Black trans women. Yes. Tweet and follow Elle at Soul Free Dreams. Let's welcome our panelists, everyone. So there's a chair here because I really don't intend to stand for 2 hours and 4 and 5 instead of. It's not part of the contract. So remember, we are using the hashtag. Yes, Black Trans Revolution. Make some noise. Oh, it's a several things, so I hope you got it. Okay. It's a rotating thing. Every 10 seconds. Okay, great. Okay, wonderful. And then I missed the check-in. Traffic is a bitch in New York City. One of the things I do not miss. There we go. Oh, wonderful. So here's our social media, what you want to call it, our keypad for the social media. So I definitely want to thank everyone who came out today. Definitely want to thank NYU for hosting such an amazing opportunity for us to come together and engage in healing, restoration, fellowship, and action for our community. This is also an opportunity for us to learn a little bit and share a little bit. And there's going to be some tough conversations. So I hope that everyone left their feelings at the door, especially if you're cis and non-Black. There's feelings at the door. Thank you so much. I want to take this moment to honor our ancestors, those who have come before us and paved the way. Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, those who have paved the way for us. Miss Major Macy Griffin, Monica Roberts, Valerie Spencer, Ruby Corrado, and those who have fallen, our brothers and sisters and kindred, who are no longer with us. Ashe. So I want to provide a bit of context for today's conversation. How many people in the room have heard of Black Lives Matter? How many people in the room have heard of Trans Women of Color Collective? Also, this is not a basic audience. Wonderful. Wonderful. Great. And so today, I just want to jump right in. If you've been able to follow some of the work that we're doing, TWOCC and Black Lives Matter began some collaborative conversations back in October around the issues that we are fighting for, both against structural oppression, anti-criminalization, the anti-Blackness that is so rooted in so many of the work that we're doing. And so we wanted to see how we can work together. The same violence that is killing Black trans women is killing Black men, is killing Black women, is killing all of us. And so it's important for us to come together in a unified front so that we can heal through the pain and trauma that we're causing each other, and also move forward in a way that we can work in unison to dismantle white supremacist, cis patriarchy, all of that, right? The academic term for white supremacy. Okay, and so the particular conversation we have extended from a student town hall that we held in collaboration with Black Lives Matter. Some of the thoughts around that conversation was about the appropriation of TDOR. And also we wanted to acknowledge how violence happens in spaces that are not safe for trans women of color, and particularly the protests and the rallies, which had like a singular narrative around the lives of Black cis heterosexual men. And so we wanted to find out how could we have conversations and dialogues that were just inclusive, but worked in collaboration, and also followed the lead of the Black trans woman who was most disproportionately impacted by structural oppression. And so some of the conversation objectives range from acknowledging that it is cis folk who are killing trans folk. We also wanted to acknowledge how structural oppression manifests in all our lives. We wanted to dissect the layers of how physical violence in the trans community is a side effect of the structural oppression that we all face. And we also wanted to explore the ways in which we can work in tandem to dismantle these systems whose sole purpose is to seek and destroy us and have us destroy each other. Some of the questions that we talked about was, why are they killing us? Why are cis folk killing trans women of color? And what is structural oppression and how is it manifest in our lives? A lot of people did not understand what structural oppression was, so we had the opportunity to discuss that. Other questions range from, why aren't our movements funded? Why are trans women of color expected to work for free? What does healing look like? What does solidarity look like? And what does revolution look like? And so we had this conversation on Twitter, and of course it's 140 characters, but it was explosive and it was an amazing time. So when Charlie contacted me and wanted to expand upon that conversation, it was a no-brainer. And so we're excited to be here. And so without further ado, let's jump right in, shall we? Okay. The first question. Well, here's the context. Last year, the LGBT community celebrated the 45th anniversary of Stonewall Rebellion, which was led by trans women of color, Goddess Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. We also witnessed amazing strides in legislative reform advancing marriage equality and inclusion in the military for gays and lesbians. Last year, the trans community of color suffered a devastating blow. 12 trans women of color were brutally murdered in a 6-month span with no national outrage. We are 6 weeks into the new year, and 6 trans women of color have been brutally murdered. January 9th, Goddess Edwards, 20 years old, Kentucky. January 17th, Goddess Lamia Beard, 30 years old, Virginia. January 26th, Ty Underwood, 24 years old, Texas. January 31st, Tasia Gabriela De Jesus, 33 years old, San Francisco. And February 9th, Goddess Penny Proud, 21 years old, New Orleans. The average age of my sisters is 26. In a knee-jerk response, we have seen few statements and press releases from LGBT organizations mentioning the violence, but no clear action steps to end the structural violence faced by trans women of color. So the question is, what do you think is the cause of the lack of outrage from mainstream society, the LGBT, and Black communities regarding the life of the Black trans woman?
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
There's so many answers to that, but I think really there's always this undercurrent of this myth of like the trans booty monster. Okay, up until recently, this whole like gay panic or trans panic was like a real defense when people were defending themselves around murdering, transgender people. So I think that this idea I think is a constant undercurrent that's happening, particularly when we're talking about looking for sympathy or empathy or compassion in spaces that are non-LGBT, in mostly straight places. I think the idea that transgender people, that we are actually fully human beings, right, and that we are not these perverts and that we are not out here to deceive you, particularly for trans women. There's this pervasive narrative that trans women are trying to deceive men into sex with them, and that is just not the case. That's not the case at all. But I think subconsciously, even though trans people are definitely having a surge of visibility, which is great, I think a lot of the LGBT organizations are starting to, in small increments, are starting to realize what's happening in the lives of trans people of color and how they've ignored us for so long. But I think there is still this undercurrent. And the thing is that that's what speaks the loudest in these pockets of silence. When all of these black trans women are being brutally murdered, overkilled, when they're not saying anything, these are the things that I hear that ring true for me.
Well, for me, I feel like there's several reasons why there's lack of outrage. For me, the biggest thing that, as a trans woman of color, that I encounter is our lives are simply just not valued in this society. People don't think our lives matter. They don't think that we deserve to be here and exist. That fundamental principle, I strongly feel, is part of the reason why there's a lack of outrage. Like Brother Teague spoke and Goddess Lourdes stated, there's a lot of structural oppression. And that's part of it too. And there's just a lot of people who just don't choose to want to understand, who don't want to empathize, who don't want to allow people to self-determine their gender as they see fit. And it's fucked up.
Thank you for that. I'm actually thankful for this space. Inevitably, we will fight for the things and the people that we care about. We'll fight for shit that we care about. And we don't fight for the things that we don't care about. Now, the way that I want to think about the complexities of this is by referencing an issue an event that happened in Newark, and it's a way to get at what I think are some of the issues that are relative to what it means to be cisgender in a world that caters to cisgender people, that teaches us to think about ourselves and not trans folk. And this is different because I want to reference CeCe McDonald, who was a cisgender lesbian, 15-year-old black, aggressive identified female. Now, when CeCe was murdered by an adult black male, she was 15. People said, well, was she murdered because she was lesbian? Was she murdered because she was young? Was she murdered because she was a female living in a hood? Some folks said she was murdered because all of those things. What's interesting is when she was murdered, folk could not even, they couldn't even get with the fact that a child was dead.
Right.
A child was dead, but they couldn't even feel like they could not empathize with the death because they had questions around religiosity. Well, was she a sinner? So you had churches that would not even speak up because inevitably they thought that she was wrong, living in quote-unquote sin, and therefore not valuable or sort of valued enough to be cared about. She was also a girl child in a heteropatriarchal, cis-patriarchal system, right? So there were folk that's like, well, she shouldn't be on the street so late. I'm using that story to say that there are so many so many levels of 101, so many unlearnings and learnings that we need to do. But here's the thing, that is not the work of you sisters to do for us. What I'm saying is that if there is, and I'm saying that this is not only the problem of cisgender heterosexual individuals, this is also LGBT cisgender folk too, that a lot of the issue is there is still a lot of learning we have to do with the ways in which we use language, the ways in which we understand our sex and gender selves, and around gender nonconformity and so many other things, but that work isn't yours to do. If the issue is that there is 101 course that we need to do, I'm using this in quotes, and a 202, that shit is our work. And I want to say that we need to own that and do that work and not allow that to be, and I'm saying allow it because we do. We are complicit in this. We have agency. If we are ignorant of things that we need to know, it's because we choose to be.
I just want to thank you for bringing that into the space. Like, we have so much work to do already just by living and like unapologetically showing up into spaces that were not created for us. And I think the reality of why we see a lack of outrage is the fact that we challenge everything that white supremacy has taught all of us to be. And I think that's the thing. People can't center our lives into their own, and so it causes them to not care. And so these type of conversations that we have, they're challenging for people because we're saying, hey, guess what? Like, this should not like be something that should be going like unmissed from you. Like, this should be on your radar every single time, because what we do, we don't just fight for ourselves. We don't. When Black cis men are murdered, we are outraged by that. And so I think that this lack of outrage also doesn't honor the intersections of who we as Black trans women are.
Absolutely. Oh my God, so much on this panel. I've said so many times, like, this is not your one-on-one engagement. I am not your one-on-one. And so it's important that folk actively engage in the elevation of their own consciousness. Especially if you want to be understood, it's important that you understand others. And I think one of the really most important things that you hit on, and so did Darnell, about the learning and unlearning. Like, I think that cis folk really need to understand and come to terms with the fact that they have been lied to. You have been lied to. And let me be the first one to tell you, if none of your friends ever told you, you have been lied to. You do not have to perform gender. You do not have to live within these restrictive boxes. You do not have to show up the way the white man tells that you need to show up. You can choose how you want to dress every single day. You can choose to have long hair, short hair, no makeup, some makeup. You can choose and change your mind the next day. And no one has a right to say a fucking thing to you about it. Come on. Right? So, I really think that when cis folks really realize that you get to choose how you identify. You get to choose if you wear a dress today. You get to choose all of these things. And I think one of the things that about trans people that I marvel about every day, trans and gender nonconforming, and people who just deny the gender binary, is that they choose their own path. And I understand that you may be hating on that a little bit, but it's okay. It's okay. So let's move on to our next question. We know that every 28 hours a Black person is murdered, and every 32 hours a trans person is murdered. Trans women of color are disproportionately impacted by structural violence and oppression. Lack of access to jobs, housing, and healthcare. According to a national survey, Injustice at Every Turn, Black transgender people live in extreme poverty, with 34% reporting a household income of less than $10K. 32% have lost their jobs due to bias, and 41% have experienced homelessness. When we look at our national, mainstream, and LGBT social justice organizations and institutions, why do you think that their leadership is not reflective of those most disproportionately impacted by structural oppression?
I'll just jump right in. And I would just say, like, just real talk, like, the reality is that people affected by structural oppression they don't even know how to get in contact with those people. They don't even know where to go and find those people. And so, like, when you don't have people who actually have been through that life involved in your organizations, of course, there's going to be a blind eye to the realities of our lives. And so, like, that we have to start there and say, like, there's no one there to even reach us. There's nobody to say, hey, call home. It's none of that. And so, like, we have to start there. They don't know how to reach us.
I think that what's important to understand is that these structures, these organizations are working within really racist and misogynistic systems, right? So we're in this matrix. So it's not enough for us just to think like these LGBT organizations are not properly developing leadership amongst people of color, amongst trans people of color. They're not, because that's not what they're structured to do. Straight up, this is really not what they're structured to do. So I like for us to really start to reframe this conversation instead of like pining and asking and wanting and compromising with certain organizations. It's really about finding the avenue for ourselves. And I just came back from Creating Change Denver, which is like the biggest, right? Which is like the biggest LGBT convention conference on the planet. It's like it's like Game on Fifth Row. There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on. But however, there were a lot of really amazing conversations. And one thing that was amazing that happened was the storm, honey. Trans folks of color took over that stage during the plenary. They snatched that mic from Clay Clinton and demanded and made demands towards LGBT organizations and towards societies at large. But the next step in this conversation is, putting these demands out there, but also saying that we can really create these avenues for ourselves, right? If we're going to keep asking these questions, and we're never going to get the answer we want, ever. So I think it's less about assimilation, and I use that word loosely, and more about us really finding ways in which we can empower ourselves.
I just wanted to just chime in really quick and just say that that's why TWOCC exists.
How you doing?
Because we don't ask for any help.
Exactly.
And that's the reality of why we are here, is because we are helping ourselves. And I just want to also add that it's not so much, I think, pining.
Accountability, right?
It's accountability. And I think questioning people and holding them accountable is definitely not pining. You know what I'm saying? Like, we're trying to work within this system. Not that we're trying to work within it, but some folks don't have a choice. So if I have to work within this system, why are you not hiring me? And I think a lot of what's happening is it's mirroring, these LGBT orgs are mirroring what's going on in the mainstream society.
That's true.
Exactly.
I guess I'll just kind of piggyback here. I think I would like to invoke the name of Audre Lorde into this space. And Audre Lorde, she has an essay where she writes about hierarchies of oppression and the ways in which Black folks, some women, those who are marginalized the most, in other words, how we have a way of internalizing white supremacy, but then also perpetuating it in terms of how we structure our social justice movements. And Audre Lorde, she convicts us. She really pushes us to think about, why do we look to whiteness and to white supremacy, to colonialism as a means of organizing? Why do we actually look at those structures to actually structure our own groups? And certainly we can praise the NAACP, for example, not to throw them under the bus, but I think we certainly have to call into question this notion of assimilating into white culture, this notion of always wanting to perform and to put on for white people. And I think there's a way in which these things get actually reinscribed within social justice movements. To the point where we start to embody this radical respectability. It's like we have to put on for each other within the movement, and then we have to put on for white people once we leave the rally or the march. So I think in this moment, I'm so thankful for this space and for TWOCC really pushing us to think about what we are doing, to actually sit back and to meditate on the propaganda that we're pushing, to really think about the things that we organize around, the lives we organize around. If we think about all of the Black trans women who have been killed this year, there has been no outcry, literally nothing from Black people, and that is appalling, actually. And if we even think about the Daniel Holtzclaw case in Oklahoma, where he raped almost 15 Black women, and there was no kind of outcry. Nobody wanted to go to Oklahoma City, but everybody went to Ferguson, and these things were happening simultaneously. So I think we need to think about how we silence and erase people who are not cisgender heterosexual Black men.
Shame.
I mean, I don't have too much more to offer than that, than to say that in sort of national mainstream LGBT organizing, not all LGBT lives matter. And that's really clear. And I think that their job, a lot of national organizations' job is to secure those who are, secure power and access to things for those who are already closest to the center. White, cisgender men. I mean, you think about the push for marriage equality, this notion of, sort of, it's all, in so many ways. And it's one of those questions where it's like, well, we know why.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, and just, and I'm glad that, like, we have these type of spaces to continue to say out loud, like, we actually see you. Many of us work within organizations where we see administrations that don't reflect the consumers that they serve. We work amongst people where there are no leadership. that no persons on leadership roles are reflective of the black and brown trans people that they're I mean, we know this, right? Like that it's organized around a matrix of white racial supremacy, heteropatriarchy, homopatriarchy. And it's like, so what folks are really trying to get is what I'm going to say this. But white, I'm speaking now because, you know, this is like space where we're with white folk. Like, white LGBT folk, white lesbians, white bisexual, white gay, cisgender folk. You know, it can't be about fighting so that you can be at the same level of white straight couples so that you can get the shit that they got. When in fact, the people that are really mattering, a politic, a radical politic, and I'm naming myself in this critique. A radical politic is always going to go to the edges of the margins and reach and start there. We're not even having any conversation about disabled folks. We don't even hear that lifted up here. We want to I want us to have real conversation about who's left out willingly.
Right.
This is not shit that's done on like some I'm conscious about this. This is willful disregard, willful ignoring, because we know that as long as I can secure power for those who look closer to those who are already in the center, then we got the shit, or everybody else can go ahead on the side. I'll get to your parade after I get mine, and that's when we can't do that work. I'm part of that critique too.
Absolutely, I know one of the TWOCC, we always say like, assimilation was never the goal. This fight is for liberation. And all the laws, if you gave us all the laws do not change hearts and minds. Not that I care to change your heart and mind, because I would suggest that you just get out of my way. But, like, the whole meme is like, oh, we need to change hearts and minds. And I'm like, I'm not interested in changing your heart or your mind, you know, because I just want to live my life and hang out with my friends and do the things that I want to do. I don't want to engage in your healing because you're not even interested in my healing. And so I think that with TWOCC, we have stopped asking this particular question, begging these organizations, hire us. For what? We will still have cis white people as our boss. And that's not the goal, right? You know, and I'm not interested in assimilation, I'm not interested in equality, because it will not free black trans women. We have to create our own, we have to work within our own system, and that's why we work among cooperative economics. You know, Casa Ruby is our fiscal sponsor, and Casa Ruby in DC is an LGBT center created and led by a trans woman of color. And she employs 12 trans women of color. And I don't know any, and they all directors. So I don't know any LGBT organization that has 2 directors that are trans women of color. And so it's challenging when these organizations have L, G, and B, and a T, and then they receive those fundings, right? And they're not doing that work. So it's important for us to stop asking them why, and just create our own. Right. So, juicy. So now we want to talk about, we just talked about it. What does a shift in leadership and accountability in social justice movement looks like? It looks like us creating our own shit. You know, we can hold people accountable, but it's also important for us to create our own shit. I know one experience that I had, living in New York City for 12 years. My first job was at New York Harm Reduction Educators. Yes, I'll name them. I made $10 a day in a Metro card. Like a black trans woman, what was I supposed to do with that? Running their mobile syringe exchange clinic. You know, and they did not understand the importance to invest in my future and to invest in my life. And so, you know, it's challenging when we have to struggle just to live. And so what does a shift in leadership in our social justice movements look like?
You know, I think we did touch on it a little bit. You know, I think it's important for us to own our own narratives, and we have the space to own our own narratives. By us owning our own narratives, we are at the forefront of guiding the cultural paradigm shift, right? Also, understand this. You know, I've worked for large LGBT organizations for the better part of the last 10 years, right? And what's happening now, gay marriage is taking off. And that's where all the money was coming from. The money was coming from these gay white men who just wanted to be like their straight white brother, okay? And just have all this, in marriage for a lot of us was really just like whatever. You know, we had bigger fish to fry than that, but I'm glad marriage equality is taking off, and that's great. Well, understand this, that there is a gap in the funding now. So now that marriage equality is taken off, they're trying to figure out where they're going to get the money from. They're trying to figure out where to get the money from. And the thing is, and this is where we step up and say, if you want to try to get this money, you're going to have to really restructure everything you're doing to be about us. So that's what I'm talking about. If we're going to really be able to control our own narratives and make sure that we're in leadership positions and making sure that the issues that are facing the Black trans community are at the forefront of our movements and at the forefront of everybody's thought process, we have to be ahead of it. And also, I think we have to work from this model of abundance. I think a lot of times we're working from this scarcity model that there isn't enough. There's enough space, there's enough resources, there's not enough talent, we don't have enough people. We have more than enough.
Yes.
We have more than enough to do what we need to do for ourselves. You know? So I think it's really important. Right now, we're at a pivotal time right now. There's all kinds of movements and moments happening, right? And I think a lot of us, and there's a lot of young people, I mean, we're looking at Black Lives Matter, we're looking at the movements that happening in Ferguson, all these, there's so many things happening right now. And what I'm seeing some folks really trying to understand it and reaching back, right? Really reaching back to, the civil rights movements of yesteryear and all its glory and all its romanticism and, give it up for that time and for the things that happened. But what we also have to understand is that, that blueprint of prosperity and hopefulness and fighting for civil rights that the baby boomers laid down for us left a lot of us out. Okay? It left so many of us trans and gender non-conforming folks and gay and lesbian people out of the narrative who were the background of their fucking foreground. Okay? And we have to understand is that today is a new day. Like, the culture that we create as Black, trans and gender non-conforming people is a culture that is exported to every corner of this globe, from our fucking style to our language to our attitudes. So we have to understand that we are really, we're not losing here. Okay? We're not losing here, okay? We still exist, right? We're still affecting the culture the world over. We have Beyonce, for God's sakes. And I'm saying that to say this. Seriously. We have Beyonce and Michael Jackson. We live in a world that's trying to kill us. Every system, every structure, on every part of this world is trying to kill us, and we are here. So I think we need to start really reframing how we're thinking about our movements and start understanding that everything that we want is already right here in us.
No, I think something that's also really imperative and something that's important in building social justice movements is how folks involved in the movements are engaging. And so I think that's something that we don't talk about a lot. It's like what's happening behind the scenes. And so I think it's really important that we name the fact that you actually have to engage in people that share analysis and practices that mirror your own. And that's something that we don't spend a lot of time talking about because we just naturally assume that because you look like me or you look like what a great protester is or you look like what a great leader is, but then behind the scenes you ain't really doing what people think you are doing. And so I think that's something that we really need to focus on when we're having these conversations, because I've learned, and I'll speak for myself, that everybody that I've aligned myself with, that's not my sister. Everybody that I thought was my brother was not my brother. And so it's really important to know what your role in the movement is, and also what others' role is, and what y'all can collectively do together to make sure that the movement continues to thrive and prosper.
I think what I didn't address the first time around, I talked about mainstream, national, mostly white, cisgender organizations. I also wanted to bring up the responsibility of us Black folk, and we are also culpable. And so I think we as Black folk need to be having this conversation, and I think particularly mostly cisgender-led. And even LGBT organizers who are Black. I mean, we need to be figuring out what we need to be doing better work. Yeah. In short. And one of the things I see in terms of accountability, anybody, if we're holding up that Black Lives Matter sign, but we don't really care about all Black lives, we need to put it down. Right? So maybe what we were trying to get at is, okay, so if we're not going to rely on the mostly white national mainstream organizations, then at the least, who we need to be turning to our quote-unquote sisters, brothers, our sisters, whoever they are, and say we need to really have a conversation. And these are the groups that need to be held accountable, because we definitely need to be standing on the front line for trans women of color, trans people.
Absolutely. If we're going to shift these narratives, We need to uplift the most oppressed and marginalized. And that's my sisters. So for me, if you're not starting from that point, you're not saying nothing.
Oh.
You can tell she got a radio show. Real quick and concise read.
I think Black Lives Matter has been dealing with and thinking about very critically actually is how Black-led organizations have a tendency to only invite lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender folks into the conversation when it's time to talk about LGBT issues. And to be real, if we want to embody this notion of all Black Lives Mattering, LGBT folks need to be in the conversation from the very beginning. They need to be a part of your organizations. They need to be in the room. And we need to stop essentializing the trans experience in particular, and just having a trans forum and then wanting trans people to educate us about our cis privilege. Because much of that wrestling and that internal wrestling, because you really have to give up. You have to give up and renounce, literally, that cis privilege if you're trying to fight for the liberation of all Black people. And that means confronting the people in your family, your friends. That means, for me, it meant leaving my church. So you have to make a conscious decision when people don't want to fight for all Black people to leave the room in some instances.
I think also, just thinking about shifting the narrative and leadership within our communities, I think it's also important for us to start thinking about this outside the organizational context and thinking about having these conversations in our communities and in our families. My wife and I, we talk a lot about sexism and misogyny. My wife can't walk 2 blocks down the street without being accosted. Like, it's to the point where either I have to go with her everywhere she goes, or she has to be on the phone with me. And I've had men, I hear them talking to her. She's been on FaceTime with me, and they get in her space to see what she's doing. So I think what we need to do, and it's something I really want to work hard on, is us starting to have intra-community conversations about sexism and misogyny, because I really think that this really like perverse and racialized sexism that is spewed at Black women, cisgender women, and non-transgender women is also how white supremacy shows up in all Black spaces. Okay, which is a whole other conversation. But I think this is something that's really important, and I think this is really what we need to really have to start talking about. Because again, like, we're talking about these organizations, but these organizations still exist within these systems, and it's and that is just such an uphill battle. But and also we're trying to work towards dispelling this myth that Black people are more homophobic or transphobic. That's just not the case. That's absolutely not the case if we give each other a chance. Really disassociate ourselves from this narrative and divest from these narratives, divest from all of these things, and really turn inwards towards each other. And I think that's when we'll really start to see some really like something that's counter and something that's productive and something that's really holistic and healing for our community.
Just 2 things quickly. I kind of disagree with that. Okay. And I had a huge argument actually last night. Huge. I don't want to bring. What was it about, Katrina? It was actually about the same topic. Tell us more. No, I don't want to bring trauma here. No, but seriously, it was about whether or not what TWOCC said is true, which is whether or not, and it started from the Lee Daniels making that statement, and that's how me and someone got into it.
Someone? What
Yeah.
statement?
Make it hot. Don't quote me. I know exactly, like, I don't want to mess it up. Do you know the? I know what Lee already said.
Go ahead. I'll let you say it.
I haven't heard the exact statement, but I know that Lee Daniels has really been committed to this idea that Black people are the most homophobic people on the planet. I do know that.
Yeah. I would say they're the most homophobic because it was created. We know where it comes from. It stems from white supremacy, as you said. However, when I think about the violence that I have experienced personally, the catcalls, the physical violence, the harassment, it comes from white people because they deny me access to life.
Right.
But then it's perpetuated by Black people when they reenact it. And they begin to perform for white people by assimilating into this narrative that this is what happens. And so I think that's what we see. I think we don't see the structural oppression that is wielded by white people because for some reason we like to look to our own and throw the stones at them. But I think we all need to turn around and throw the stones at white supremacy to dismantle that shit because it's fighting and killing all of us, right? And so when you deny a trans woman of color access to resources, you're doing the work of the oppressor. And so you really need to understand that when you misgender a trans woman of color, you are doing the work of the oppressor. And so you need to really understand that. And when you misgender us, that is an act of violence. When you deny us opportunities, that is an act of violence. And that is what structural oppression looks like. When you take up spaces and talk about trans women and their trans women of color in the space, that's an act of violence. We can speak for ourselves, our mouths, they work very well for many things. And so it's important that you understand that we have agency over our own lives. And so when we talk about shifting the narratives, we're talking about people who are not disproportionately impacted by structural oppression, taking a step back, not getting wrapped up in their feelings, and letting those who are most affected take the place that white folk places as leaders in this movement to help to gain the liberation that we're seeking.
The other thing I was going to say, that's what I really wanted to touch on, was going back to what you said about we need to go back within into the community. And I actually definitely do agree with that. And so for me, it's about being intentional. Don't just say trans lives matter. When's the last time you actually had coffee with a trans person? When's the last time you engaged with a trans woman of color?
When's the last time you donated to TWOCC?
Please don't take your donations, www.
I brought my square.
You said
www.TWOCC.us. So for me, that's a big thing. And Elle touched on that, and Brother Darnell touched on that, and Brother Ahmad touched on that, and that's a big thing that we all, I think, need to really focus on, is being intentional with our relationship with trans women.
Shame.
I'll just say this. Bell Hooks, she has said that patriarchy knows no gender. And I think if we think about white supremacy knows no race. And I think there's a way in which black folks can really be some of the greatest, if you will, perpetuators of anti-blackness. And will be so anti-black, even while fighting for black liberation. I don't actually understand. It's oxymoronic, actually.
All right.
So we really need to think about how we're internalizing oppression. That's literally what it comes down to. So I talk to family members all the time who have done, go hard in the paint for black men in particular, but won't say anything for black women, even though I was raised by black women. And I just don't understand it, don't get it. It just makes no sense to me. So I'm always thinking about the ways in which I've internalized stuff. Each day for me is a day of liberation. Each day I wake up, I'm like, what am I getting free of today? That's the mindset that I have in the morning when I wake up. And while I'm meditating on that thought, there's something that I have to get rid of, either it's from childhood. There's a lot of trauma that a lot of us don't face and don't actually sit with and don't heal from. We start perpetuating violence towards each other, the people who look like us, because we haven't dealt with our internal self. So I think this movement, as much as it's about rallies and marches, it's about healing. And we really need to get in tune with healing our minds, healing our spirits, healing our bodies, noticing when we're tired, when it's time to sit down, when it's time to love on each other and on ourselves, when it's time to eat, when it's time to work out, when it's time to have sex. Like, you have to really get in tune with yourself. And there are a lot of people in the movement who are like tight. They're tight in a number of different ways. You gotta get free, you gotta get loose, in order to fight for liberation. That's it.
I just wanted to chime in really quick and also say that like we need to really focus on what we are actually doing. I don't want you to just think about it. I want you to actually acknowledge what you are doing, because I could be very honest with everyone. I don't have a problem doing that. On this panel. I don't know anybody. I just met some of these people for the first time. I have not engaged with them prior to this panel. And so for me, like, I'm listening to things that folks are saying, and it's beautiful. It really is. But I wanted to actually start doing these things that we really believe in. Because we believe in it and we have the power to tell these people, but we also have the power to actually make sure we're engaging the same way that we just delivered a message. And so, like, I think that's important as well.
Yes. There's a difference between analysis and praxis.
Say that.
I said there's a difference. All y'all academics up in here don't play games. There's a difference between analysis and praxis.
Say it again.
You can say it, but are you living it?
Say it again.
And when someone calls you on it, you have to be like, okay, maybe. Let me check that, right? And not like be aggressive and caught up in your feelings because someone is holding you accountable to the space that you're occupying. And because they're letting you know it's an act of violence. And see, I'm from Detroit. And if you know anything about Detroit, not much talking happens when violence happens, right? So like, it's important that when a trans woman of color is offering you the gift of accountability, that you recognize it as a gift. Because many trans people, and particularly trans people of color, they don't talk, they pop off, right? And so you'll find yourself in ER, or they may find themselves committing harm to themselves because you have taken up so much space in their lives. So it's important that when a trans person tells you when a black trans person tells you their truth, believe them. Yes. So let's transition on to, this is a juice, this is so delicious. Let's start down at Darnell because we've been starting this way. Darnell, when folks scream and chant, all lives matter, what comes to mind? There were some questions offered by the students, and so I did not want to erase their narratives. So.
I mean,
Y'all are carrying.
it's
amazing.
I mean, so yeah, the question makes sense. So, right. So initially what comes to mind is the notion of invisibilizing people's real experiences, their material realities, their lives, their identities. And who do I mean by people? I mean this quest to sort of somehow turn black experiences or to take the shine off of anti-blackness and somehow to make it seem like all impressions are the same, that all forms of marginalization are like equal, that there isn't a thing that is like asymmetrical power and inequity that is at work, that are real time. And let me move from those words and talk about, because we use a lot of this sort of rhetoric. I'm talking about like material realities, inequity that like in terms of differences in how people are paid, differences in the ways in which people are allowed access to things like healthcare, differences to how people are allowed access to things like life. That when we say something like all lives matter, we try to erase over all of that shit, and it makes sense why we do it. Because when we start naming particularities, we also then, some of us will be complicit and named in those critiques that are being offered. I don't want to be named, none of us want to be acknowledged as the person who has his or her or their boot on the neck of somebody else. That's not what we want. We want to be able to name always whose boot is situated on our necks. So this is what this does. It not only does it invisibilize, it removes us from the equation as the oppressor. And I think that that's very dangerous.
Shay?
Absolutely. For me, when I looked at the question, it was just like you said, Lourdes, it was just like basic. For me, I'm like, no. They don't clearly in the society. I mean, we can look at all aspects. We can look at the way trans women are just, their deaths are ignored, misgendered. There's violence that occurs after they die. So do they really all matter? I don't think so. Not to society. I mean, I know my life has value. So, I'm going to leave it at that.
I got into it with somebody on Twitter, or on Instagram behind this. Somebody they thought it was a good idea to tag me in some All Lives Matter or something or other. And so, you know, I was going back and forth with this person, just, you know, laying into them, telling them why I was all fucked up and why this is basically, you know, invisibilizing all of the hard work the black people are doing behind this, and, you know, what I mean, all these things. And it was a young black woman who had started this. A young black woman who was the head of this of a racial justice organization at a school and at a college in Ohio. So what that said to me, so that really made me start to think about the conversations about race that are happening in institutions of higher education that don't have this type of populace, right? That doesn't have a strong black queer presence, that doesn't have a strong black presence, that, you know, these young kids are trying to grapple with these ideas around racial justice and inequity, and this is how the narrative is being filtered to them. So my heart really went out to this poor girl, because we were going back and forth, and she just could not understand why I was reading her so badly. But you know, she had it coming. Also, I think when we talk about All Lives Matters, it takes away from the affirmation of what Black Lives Matters is, right? Because it's not. This is about the state-sanctioned violence and savage murdering of black people. Okay, this is something that the system is allowing to happen. This is about the medical-industrial complex that has never given a fuck about us. This is about the This is about the pre-K to prison pipeline. Okay, this is about inadequate school systems that are churning out a bunch of D students who are not ready to live and prosper in this world. All of these things are having a disproportionate effect on black people. All this racism, all this misogyny is having a direct effect on the quality of our lives. And it was just at these instances, with the death of Trayvon Martin and with Eric Gardner and Nisha McBride, you know, and Mike Brown, those were just the straws that broke the camel's back. That was just the icing on the cake. So when people co-opted to say all lives matter, what you're telling me is that I don't matter. What you're telling me is that you're not seeing how all of these systems are telling us each and every day that our lives are less valuable. So that's how I felt. That's how I feel when I see the All Lives Matter situation.
I just want to say shout out to Ohio real quick. All day, every day. Shout out to 614 baby. Milo, what up? But no, word. So like the reality is, like, when I hear All Lives Matter, I think about all of those people whose names you do not know. I think about the 4 black trans women from Ohio: Samaya Dove, Tiffany Edwards, Brittany Nicole Kidd Sturgis.
Come on now. Samaya Dove.
I think about those names, and I think about the derailment that happens when people say All Lives Matter. Because if All Lives Matter, we wouldn't have to say Black Lives Matter so much. And also, when I say Black Lives Matter, people wouldn't try to erase me from saying that as a black trans woman, as if I have to choose one of these things over the other. The beautiful thing about Black Lives Matter and why I embrace it so much is because before I was aware of who I was as a trans woman, I was always aware that I was black. Right. And that's been the one constant that's been very prevalent in my life. I've never been able to erase that, and I never would. And so, like, I just think that who the fuck is saying All Lives Matter, and like why? And so, like, when I hear it, you know, and I got into an argument with one of my very good dear friends who's a police officer in Ohio. And, you know, she told me that when she took oath to be a police officer, that, like, she took it with the vow that all lives matter. And so I said, you have to understand the history of what not only Black Lives Matter mean, but literally what Black lives mean in America. And so, like, for you not to understand that history and why it is so important for us to say these things is complete erasure. And that's essentially what I think about when I hear All Lives Matter.
Absolutely. I just want to quickly say, like, for me, that's so key that you brought that up. As a trans woman who actually has worked in law enforcement, I can say that that's bullshit. All lives do not matter in this system. And I've seen it. And I still see it every day.
Ashay? It's okay. Because it is challenging. Even with All Lives Matter, it's even challenging with Black Trans Lives Matter.
I got into with some folk on Twitter and Facebook who clearly did not know my profile when they were like, this is about black people. I was like, bitch, I'm black. I'm black. My dad is black. They all black. The men I sleep with are black. The women too. So like, it was challenging. They were like, oh, wait your turn. I was like, what? Oh. Problematic. It really not like, so like it's challenging when folk try to take our agency away. Some fighting words. I thought folks already pop up on this stage to have questions. Okay, let's get into another one. It's a good one. How can people of color effectively How can people of color effectively dialogue about intraracial privilege? More specifically, what are some suggestions for engaging in sustainable coalition building between LGBTQ and Black communities?
Did you tap out?
Had a long teaching day.
There's so much happening in this question. First, I don't like the idea of framing this as building between LGBT and Black communities because there are Black LGBT. Obviously, number one. Intraracial privilege. I'm not sure what that's asking, but I'll say this here. I think that there's a lot of anti-Black racism that happens within people of color. Okay. Non-Black people of color sometimes are super racist. Okay. And we're not dealing with that. And that has to be dealt with, I think, number one. We're looking at white supremacy, racism amongst Black people. You know, colorism is real. Being color struck is real. It's real. And that is also stems from white supremacy. And I think that these are the conversations that we need to be having with each other. I am not in the business of talking to white folks about their own white supremacy and about their own racism. I'm not in the business of teaching folks how not to be racist. We're already fighting for laws. Okay, these laws that we're fighting for are so that white people can treat us like human beings. Okay, straight up and down. These laws out here, these voters' rights laws, civil rights laws are all saying, hey, white power structure, could you treat us like a human being? I'm not wasting my breath doing any of those things, right? Because we're already doing enough, and it's heartbreaking enough that we even have to do that. Then we got to fight for laws that have a group of people treat another group of people like people, right? That's a lot. But I think what's important is for people of color to really start deconstructing how they embody racism, how they live it in their lives every day, how it's in their souls, how it's in their communities. You know, talking about, I wrote a piece talking about the difference between love and desire. You know, love is something that's very genuine, but a lot of times desire is something that is absolutely socially constructed and influenced. And we need to think about that. We need to think about why you might only want the light skin and the light eyes and the wavy hair. Okay. You know what I'm saying? So this is what happens. So this is the racism that happens within our communities, and that we need to talk and that we need to speak to. And also for other people of color really need to get with and start understanding how anti-Black racism works within themselves and their families and within their culture.
Yesterday we were part of I was part of a conversation at Medgar Evers College in Brooklyn, and during one of the questions that came up, I was talking a bit about thinking about the diverse bodies, the diverse Black bodies, and I mean that in all types of ways. Diverse in terms of ability, diverse in terms of gender expression, who were part of a more robust and long-standing tradition of civil rights movement working. And I started talking about Bayard Rustin, and these are undergrads, and I asked them, how many people heard of Bayard Rustin, and they raised their hand. Mostly, it's a room of mostly Black students. And I talked about the way in which Bayard was criminalized because he was caught having sexual relations with another male. And as soon as I said that, I heard, oh! Black people literally gagged. So I use that as an example to say that it is absolutely necessary for us to have within Black communities, plural, conversations about the various ways that some of us have access to points of power because of things like our sexual identity, our gender expression, our ability, our status as immigrants, or what have you. And that's the type of intra-community conversation we need to have. I think we should begin. Black feminists, Black lesbian feminists have given us many, many texts on how to think through these ideas, how to think through notions of difference. One, there is no monolithic blackness, and therefore there is no monolithic Black community. That there are various experiences of Black, there are Blacknesses, and therefore there are Black experiences. And depending on how you show up as a Black person, how you're gendered, how you are expressing that gender, the type of money you got in your bank account, you are going to experience your Black life different than some others. This is the type of conversation that we need to have. So for me, I think that's it. I don't lift up Black feminists I mean that. Like they've been talking about the simultaneity of oppression since Kabani River Collective. June Jordan and Audre Lorde and Cheryl Clark and Alexis Pauline Gumbs today. So many sisters in here right now are talking about this. And I think that we need to begin to turn away from Black male charismatic leadership. And start listening to our sisters, our cisgender and our transgender sisters, and letting them. And that is not to say that we need you to mother us into liberation. Right? That is to say that we need to do the work of really opening up ourselves to hear the type of analysis that is coming from the most marginalized, the multiply marginalized within our communities, and lead the way that way. Black men, we have work to do. Black women are killed mostly and sexually harassed by people, not white people, by people that look like them. They are not the one. Listen, and I want to say this shit because we try to get real deep and like, all right, we don't want to beat each other down, but the fact is our sisters, cis and trans, are being killed by men that look like them. Mostly men that they know. Right? And I just want to put that out there because that is to say that we do have some intra-community stuff that we need to work on and own that. And also understand why that comes into being. But if we continue to act as if that shit doesn't happen, we won't be saving ourselves in the way that we need to.
Yes.
Go ahead. I think that Darnell really touched on a lot, and so I'm like, I don't know where to start with what Darnell touched on. But I think first of all, just with this question, y'all tried it, whoever. I just want to also say that like it's really important for people to create an analysis around your own privilege. You can't engage in dialogue and expect me to name that for you. You have to first name it for yourself.
Okay.
Also, I think what's really important is like to talk about like how these recent murders of Black trans women have happened and what the media has done to censor these conversations as if these Black trans women deserve to die. And so I think it's important to understand where privilege shows up in those spaces as well, because if a cisgender white woman is murdered, oh, okay, we can bring Leela. God bless her life. But if Leela Alcorn is murdered, there will be out.
It was.
It wasn't, it might be. But yeah, if there was an outpouring of support, people are still crying for Leela. And that was months ago. I don't know. They're still crying. But we have already forgotten the names of these Black trans women that were murdered. We've already erased their identities. One of the goddesses that were murdered, we didn't even want, like, a statement was released where people didn't want to acknowledge that she was trans. They wanted to erase that and shift the narrative. And so as a Black trans woman, I can tell you what the experience is of dealing with the fact of how I came into my own identity. I didn't always say trans. And so I just think it's really important for us to really understand our own analysis of ourselves before we even think that we can engage in dialogue.
Absolutely, and I think, Darnell, definitely, when you talked about there's no monolithic movement in the Black community, the same can be said for the trans community. We're not all one type and shape. We all have different experiences. We all identify differently. And I think that's something that the larger community, particularly the people of color, need to realize, is that we are not cookie cutter. We all don't look like Janet Mock. We all don't look like Laverne Cox. Some of us like hair on our face as trans women and don't mind performing gender. Some of us choose to have surgery. Some of us don't. That has no bearing on my gender status as a woman, female, whoever I choose to identify, goddess, queen, sister, ashe. So for me, that's definitely a key that you touched on.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So let's go here. What can be done beyond protesting? What are some suggestions to get on the path to allyship towards cis and trans communities of color? Yeah, we touched on it. I think for me, I think what has to be done, you know, we've been protesting for how long? For a long time. You know, and I feel like there's all this organizing and demonstrations and protests, you know, for the same things that we were organizing and demonstrating and protesting about like 50 years ago. Which is a lot, you know, and it's really heartbreaking and it's frustrating and so many things. But I think what we can do is really divest. Seriously divest. I mean, you know, I remember like it was like Black Friday, and it was telling everybody not to buy anything, and people were getting mad at black folks for shopping. You can't tell, and you can't be mad at folks. You can't tell somebody who has been working 40, 50 hours a week, saving their money to provide, you know, a nice Christmas for their child or whatever, telling them not to buy anything, right? That is unreasonable, I think. But I think there are ways in which we can all start to think about ways we can start to divest from these systems that hate us and are trying to kill us and invest in each other. Whether it's just trying to have a bartering system with folks, if it's, you know, trying to buy black owned as much as you can, if it's really thinking about homeschooling your kids, you know, really, let me tell you, I was so mad, so upset around all these things that happened with Mike Brown and Ferguson and Louise McBride, all these things, and it was just like, I really just wanted black folks just to stop. Just take your kids out of their schools. Yes. Don't go to work. Yes. That every NFL player, every NBA player, don't play. Yes. Don't put that uniform on. If you don't play for the rest of the season, make this country feel that you matter, right? But we can't. But that's a lot to ask for a lot of people who are trying to get their livelihood. So for me, I think the best thing we can do is really start to divest in any ways we can, little by little, until we become more self-sufficient with each other. And also, when we talk about building allyships between cis and transgender communities in the black community, Darnell's right. We have to understand that the black experience is not a monolith. There are black experiences. And he's also right that the problem, honestly, when we get down to a lot, this problem is masculinity. There is a huge problem with masculinity, with its nature of violence, the way racialized, way black masculinity shows up in our relationships, in our homes. You know, the number one cause of death for black women between the ages of 15 to 25 is domestic violence. Mm-hmm. They're killed by black men in their homes by the people that are supposed to be protecting them. Okay? The number one killer of black men between the ages of 18 to 25 is murder. And they are getting murdered by their brothers. Okay? So there's a huge problem with masculinity and violence and how it shows up. And I think that's a conversation we haven't been having. You know, black queer women have been having that conversation a lot more than anybody else. It really feels like, you know, black gay men and black queer men are really starting to be a part of this conversation. But for so long, it's been just the sisters having this conversation. And that's really fucked up because sexism is not their problem. It's our problem. The problem with violence and misogyny is a man's problem, and these are the things that we need to step up and really start fixing. And I think that's really the first step for us to really start thinking about what black masculinity looks like, having these difficult conversations and moving from there.
I was just going to say that I think it's really important to understand like what a protest looks like. And so, like, me showing up into spaces where I'm the only black trans woman, that is my protest. And so, like, we really have to be specific about, like, the trauma and the violence that we face every single day. Leaving our house is we don't know if we're going to come home. That's just the reality. And so, like, protesting isn't the end all. And also, like, I just think it's really important to understand that. And so, like, I think that's what I want to touch on. Thank you so much, because it just popped in my mind. TWOCC and Black Lives Matter have really created the blueprint. And granted, there's so much work to do. And so we're like, perfection is not what we are claiming. But we have really created the blueprint for what folks should be trying to follow and model and like bring into their own spaces. Letting black trans women lead and guide conversations, which we've been able to do. Things have been storified. You can go to Twitter, you can search, it's all there. But I just think it's really important to understand the work that has already been done and what we've already created. And I don't want to erase that from this conversation with you all tonight.
I just want to challenge the language that you're using about letting. Because we've been leading.
Sylvia Rivera was a leader. She led the movement. Marsha P. Johnson led the movement. So we're just following in the footsteps of our ancestors because they laid the groundwork for us to step into our leadership. And so I think that that's important as well to note. Like, this was never about inclusion, right? Black Lives Matter did not include trans women of color in the movement. They recognized the work that we're doing and understood the need for collaborative efforts in order for us to move forward as a unified front. So I think that's important about the language that we use. You're not letting us do anything. You know, we're allowing you to continue to oppress us, but watch how that changes very quickly. But I think you really should understand, like, you're not letting us, and to understand that, because that's like coming from a place of privilege. You're letting someone do something, when you're allowing them, when you're including them. This is all language of the oppressor. And we're not interested in that type of rhetoric because we've been leading. And so just to acknowledge and affirm the leadership of the Black trans women who have come before us and who are on this panel today, you know what I'm saying? And I think that's important. You can give them a hand too. Okay, so we want to open up with the Q&A. And so I think that that's important that we can hear from folk in the audience, Black, trans, and queer people to the front of the line. Yes. Yaya? Hi! Y'all know some people and stuff.
I had two questions. The first question I had was mostly directed towards the two people who are organizing with Black Lives Matter. And I liked a lot of the things that you said today. But one thing that Darnell said in particular, which was poignant, was that like a bus of people weren't taken to, like, you know, go to where the guy was raping all those women, that police officer taking advantage of those 15 different women. I don't remember what state that happened in. Oklahoma. But you did take a bus to Ferguson. You did, right? Mm-hmm. So, as leaders in this organization, when you're saying that this work hasn't been done, you're indicting yourselves directly. Mm-hmm. And so, in light of that, what are some of the things that you are doing? Because I view like ally, I view that as not like a noun. Like I view ally as an action word. So like you're allying with me right now. So if you're not allying with me at that moment, you're not an ally.
Well, thanks, and I appreciate that question. I also stopped using ally. In the last 2 weeks, I've been using the term accomplice. But interestingly enough, we just had a conversation, Patrice and I, Patrice Cullors, just probably 2 days ago, about a very brief conversation where we started talking about the possibility of doing rise to sites where some of the trans murders had happened. Now, that was a conversation that we only had because we had yet to talk first to our trans sisters who we work with, one of which is on this panel. And all to say, I think it's also the case that because Lourdes is working with us and we're constantly thinking about expanding our work such that it is moving towards the margins of the margins, we're always asking these questions, but in real time trying to figure out how to respond. So I give that example only because it's something we just talked about 2 days ago. And just as a way to say that there are folk, not only within the sort of national organizing body, but people within our own local communities, Black Lives Matter contingencies and not, who are thinking in real time on how to respond to some of these issues.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your question. I think to answer directly, I guess, to the Oklahoma situation with Daniel Hosclaw, for me personally, outside of working with Black Lives Matter, I organize around sexual violence in particular, and that's issues of rape and sexual assault on college campuses, but then also in Black church spaces. In my work in particular, I try to get cis Black men to have these conversations about rape in our communities. And the biggest issue I find is that Black men do not like to talk about rape. They don't want to talk about sexual assault, don't want to talk about domestic violence and all of these things that work and militate the existence of our sisters. So in many ways, it would be so hard, and and so difficult to even arrange something to go to Oklahoma, and that's an indictment of our community, that we are afraid and fearful and refuse actually to have these conversations. When before many Black women before they reach age 18, many of them have been raped and molested in our communities, and nobody wants to talk about that. But we'll talk about Michael Brown being gunned down in the street. And in many ways, one could argue that the Black men that are out there rallying around his life are the ones that are at home beating their wives, beating their sisters, beating their daughters, raping, molesting. And myself, I'm a survivor of child molestation, and I'm always interested in bringing that up in these spaces that lobby for Black lives. Like, are we having conversations about molestation? Are we having conversations about rape? And I know this is heavy stuff, but to be honest, the history of Black people is traumatic. It is triggering, it is heavy. And if we want to get free, we have to have these conversations. There's no more for the culture of dissemblance. We need to take down the veils. We need to really get clean and get honest. Because as much as we want to indict white people, we have to indict ourselves. Thank you.
Indulge.
Do you need a mic?
No, I think I'm good. So, I guess oh God, all these eyes. I guess my question is, how do we invest in a solidarity and movement making that is more love filled, rather than one that is focused on identity politics and guilt? Looking at the hierarchy of oppression, because oftentimes, I'm more oppressed than you, so yeah, because it's even with I think sensory movements, how we do, there are still some people who are left out.
For me, it goes back to intentionality. Try to be intentional. You're not gonna always get it right, but be intentional. I'll give you a perfect example. When Coco Jones had her show, Coco Jones is a trans woman of color here in New York who just released the EP, Who's That Lady, on iTunes. She's also part of the Trans Woman of Color Collective. She's a co-founder. She is a longtime activist, and she's just a simply amazing woman. I had her on my show a few months ago. And for me, I was like, what can I do to help Coco? What resource and power do I have that I can give to my sister to help make what she's trying to do a success? And so for when I thought about that, I was like, well, she's having a concert. Why don't we just get tickets for her show? And that's what I did. And so we had trans women of color, trans youth of color who were there sitting in the show. And so for me, I was like, that was amazing, that was good that we were uplifting the youth. And so, again, it was an intentional act. And so those are the kind of acts that we need more healing. And I'm glad you brought that up, Goddess, because that is something that I'm trying to incorporate into my show more of. I just don't want it to be a show about all these heavy topics and, all this, stuff that we already deal with. Where's the love? Where's the healing? And so that's something we need to do more of, and I'm glad that you brought that up.
I was going to say, though, and I appreciate this question, I don't think that accountability happens outside of love. I really appreciate this, that one can actually, that it's because one loves another that we can have honest conversations and that we can hold each other accountable. But I'm also thinking, maybe that's a question, what does love look like? For us in a sort of loveless world. I mean, so when we say love, which itself is a term that is so emptied of meaning, are we saying we need to be more courteous to one another? Are we saying that we need to be more generous? Are we saying that critical generosity is a sort of way that we can engage one another? That is, we can call each other out, but that it's done within a way in which I am holding you in a space of care. So I'm thinking through what that means. The other thing I'll say too, as it relates to will, I think we get it fucked up. I think we think because we stand next to each other and we raise our fist and we can talk this good talk and use all of this language that somehow I know you.
Right.
And the point is, like, how many of us have walked away from protests not only not knowing a person's name, barely know their name, let alone their life world. And for so many of us, we become signifiers. You become the T in the LGBT, the B, and not a human being. So I look at you, and I learned this, and I want to honor and say Bobby White's name in this space.
Yes.
My sister, friend from HMI, like that I met at Hedwig Martin Institute, who really taught me to move beyond thinking about identity politics, the L, the G, the B, the T, as signifiers. As people without blood pumping through their veins, as people without lived experiences, but as human fucking beings. Right? And so I think that's part of it. Like, how do I move? So if identity politics are always going to be part of the conversation because it has everything to do with power and who gets access to it. But at the same time, I think, and Ellie, you said this earlier, there is a way in which we've mistaken, I think, protest movement, something organizing work as real, tangible connection. That is getting to know your life world so that I don't have to see you as part of an essentialized category. I know not all, so I don't know. I mean, this is really wonderful. For me, I'll say this. I've been really hurt. And we may have all experienced that within working in good movements. One of the places where I experience the most pain is in social justice spaces. Folks who can give you a good ass politic, we can give you an analysis, we can talk real good, but you mean. I'm gonna just be straight up. And I experienced that. And I'm also very thoughtful about myself in this, right? So, and I don't even know what to do with all of that. Like, how do we, is it about feelings? How do we do this?
Yeah.
How do we build a new world without using the same nasty ass energy from the old world to do it?
I just want to say quickly, again, for me, it goes back to being intentional. If you don't know someone's name, ask them. Go up to them. Why don't I know this person's name? What is your name? What are you about? What drives you? Those are the things that I look for.
That's such a huge question. That's such a great question. I think a lot of us who are in these social justice spaces and do these things for a living or just for the kindness of our hearts, grapple with all the time. And it's really hard to lead with love and softness when we live in a culture that really prides itself on being hard and competitive and just like me, an individual, right? It's really, really hard to do that. But I don't think, to your question, I don't think that there's like a national contingency or like a national kind of like a thing that we can do. I think she's right. I think it's about being intentional. And I think one of the greatest things I've learned, which I learned from my wife, was amazing. She taught me, she always said, we're taught that, we're supposed to treat people how we want to be treated. But what we're supposed to be doing is treating people how they want to be treated. And that's when the intention comes in. We start asking questions and trying to figure out how people want to be treated and how they're feeling. You know what I'm saying? I have my young niece, she's like 20 years old, just, straight up good old hood girl, got a couple kids, all these things, she's that girl. She's amazing. And she was stressed about some stuff and she was really showing out. And my wife asked her, how do you feel right now? What do you need? And the girl started crying. She said, nobody ever asked her that. When she's in those spaces, when she's ready to fight, when she is pulling shit off and she's ready to go, no one has ever asked her how she felt and what she needed. And it was just that simple question that really changed the connection, right? So I think maybe it's more important for us to, again, step outside of these conversations about our advancement and step outside these conversations about our advancement and moving forward and prosperity around organizational structures and these kinds of things, and really start thinking about what we can do to embody the change and the love that we want and how we can give it to the individuals within our life and have a ripple effect like that. If that makes sense.
I think.
Y'all men taking up a lot of space.
I'm sorry. I can step back.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that it really, I was waiting for a really long time. I don't know if y'all saw. I forgot what I was going to say. But I think everybody touched on really good points, right? And so, like, Katrina said, like, be more intentional. And so, like, for me, when I hear people say intentional, I'm like, everyone thinks they're being intentional, but you first have to make your intentions more intentional. And I think it's really important to understand that in this movement in life, right? So Black trans women specifically in life, there is trauma. And so, and it's not to say that our trauma trumps any trauma, but there is really specific trauma. Like the average age of all of the women who were murdered was 26 years old this year. So I want y'all to really get into like what that looks like. I'm 27. And so you must first acknowledge like what I go through on a daily basis to even get into a space to engage with you. Like we must first understand that. And so if we're kind of coming into a space where we're like, well, I got trauma. Well, you got trauma. Well, do you know what just triggered me? And so like we really have to like give that space to live, because like what we do is we just keep putting each other's fires out.
I totally agree, because it's so super challenging, and I will own it. Like, so many people call me mean. Am I mean?
No.
They call me mean. They call me rude, antagonistic, violent. Yeah, against white supremacy. Yes. If you are emulating white supremacy in my space, I'm going to do everything in my power to shut that shit down. And that is my role in the movement. My role in the movement is to empower people like me, trans and gender non-conforming people of color, people who are left out of every single fucking conversation, especially the ones about our lives. And yes, when there is a boot on your neck, I'm not going to be nice about it. Say, excuse me, pretty. That's my neck, boo. No, I'm gonna say, bitch, what's your problem? Do you know what oppression looks like? Do you know what it takes for a Black trans woman to get up every day? Right, I have to come and fulfill gender every day. I have to put into your box so that I can be acceptable every fucking single day. Me not performing gender is an act of protest. So if I don't want to shade today to fit inside your box, right? Don't tell me I'm not fishy. Don't try to judge my femininity, because that's an act of violence. So when we talk about violence and oppression, it's not the oppression Olympics. But if you don't understand what a Black trans woman, what a trans person of color, what a gender non-conforming person, or someone who's not cis, heteronormative, or who can be passing as such, has to experience every day navigating these systems that you perpetuate, then that's the stop before the start. And I think people really need to understand what folks go through every day just to show up in the space. Even me as a Black trans woman, even someone who has what they call privilege. Let me tell you something, I don't have education privilege. My education is an act of survival. It is a tool that I use to navigate these systems. Passing is not a privilege. Passing is a tool of survival for a Black trans woman. And so you really need to understand the issues that we face every day before you tell us not to be so angry and to be so happy. Because there's nothing to be happy about when you can leave your house and your life may end. And that's the reality for anybody in this room. And that's what we need to understand, the things that connect us all. Any one of you could walk outside your house and get killed, but you won't be killed for being Black and trans. You can unshare.
Thanks for that. Those offerings. I was just really interested in how we treat each other, and often because the work that we do in social justice movement making is often trauma informed, and I just want to be sure that I bring it into the space and that we don't give that to each other.
I'll just chime in really quickly. I think also, I know we're talking a lot about loving each other, but I think we need to return to self. Like, do we love ourselves? Because I don't actually think you can love someone else if you don't love yourself. So I think we really need to dig deeply. Are we loving on ourselves enough? Do we understand how we need to be loved? And I think that is informed by trauma, but it's also informed by healing. Like, you actually have to get into healing from that trauma, and I think that is through love. So I think our radical selves can be embodied in this movement through loving ourselves and then also loving each other.
Except that you can love yourself and still be hated by,
I think that's important though. But I think that it's important to name that I think we can love ourselves But that won't always necessarily change the system
That's right.
that is hell bent on hating us.
Right.
And not loving us. So I just think that's important too. But yeah.
Right, because when does, at some point we love ourselves. Like you said, they begin to hate us. Like, who does she think she is? Now I can't love myself? You don't love me, so now I can't love myself? What is that about? What is that? That is violence in itself. Like, come on. Can't nobody love me like me, so don't get mad because I love all of me. I can't wait for you to love me, just like I don't wait for you to fight for me, just like I don't wait for you to speak up for me. Don't expect me to wait for you to love me. But love is here, but not on your terms, right? Yes.
Question?
We have a question.
In the back.
Oh, yes.
Hi. My question is sort of about what I think you all have sort of touched on, but we haven't like addressed directly, which is what are we doing? And Elle, you talked a lot about like what are we doing and really knowing like where are we going, where are we trying to go, what are we trying to do? And so one of the things I'm wondering is like, are we talking about all of this as sort of like an apple with some rotten parts that we're going to cut out? Or are we talking about we got to throw out the whole apple? You know what I mean? Are we talking about, we're talking about divesting, right? Are we talking about divesting and doing it completely differently, or divesting and creating our own way of doing things? So are we talking about sort of this like separatism, or are we talking about like for non-third way, like burn the whole thing down? And I guess like I'm feeling, I want to know what you all think about that in your own ways, because that's always a really, really personal question, is what do we feel? Personal thing in terms of like knowing yourself and knowing where you are and what you're capable of. So, I mean, in the small way that we can get to know each of you, like what do you think and what do you feel about that?
I think for me,
Never since
no, nonetheless. Shout out to my other show, it's here, Madison. I think for me, personally, because I can't speak for everyone, all of the panelists, for me, it looks like me submitting myself and aligning myself with organizations and collectives that have an analysis around dismantling systems and also have an analysis and value of my life. And that's part of the reason why I am a part of this leadership and this amazing group of women who I look up to and admire. And it's also why I have taken the position at Get Equal, because we understand that equality is like a word that really does not exist for marginalized folks. But we understand that that's what our work is about, and the systems of patriarchy and white supremacy and all of that, right? Because it's a long thing and I don't feel like saying it because I'm tired. But I think that like for me, it just means aligning myself with folks who have an analysis that mirrors my own.
I think divesting looks a lot like all of the things that you said. I think part of it is about being separate. I think part of it is about cooperative economics. It's about lowering your capacity as a person. And I think divesting isn't just about isn't just about like trying to buy black owned and trying to creating these inter-community connections, but it's also divesting from these modes of thinking. Right, really starting to divest from misogyny and racist thinking that's affecting us as black people, and thinking about misogyny and racism not in relationship to whiteness and white people. Really starting to think about how that affects us as black people and us only. I think and I think as black people in America, we have tried this before, right? We've tried the cooperative economics, right? We've tried just having these conversations with ourselves and building our own economic systems and our own education systems, and we all know what happened to that, right? Mm-hmm. Those things got burnt down. They got burnt down in Oklahoma, they got burnt down in Philly, right? So we know that these things happen. But I think that's divestment looks like that. But I think to take it a step further, we really need to start to divest in these ideas that are really holding us back. There's no like national big answer for that. Can't, like I was saying before, I don't think it. I think it's. I couldn't expect for a whole population of people to just pull out of everything that they know in their life. But I think that just little by little we can do that, and starting to have more conversations with each other, and starting to depend on each other a little bit more. I think interdependence is really important too. This idea that we're all independent, we don't need each other, that's a bunch of bullshit. You know what I'm saying? We all need each other on a global scale, on a community scale. None of us are here alone. I mean, I'm clothes because of the people that made these clothes, okay? I got here on the transit system that's run by people. So it's like, you know, we're all interdependent on each other. So I think that's important for us to bring into the space. And also, what I've noticed here, and I notice a lot when I do these panels, we're talking about us as people of color making space for everybody, but we do not create space for disabled and deaf, queer, Black people. We do not. There's no ASL here. There are so many brilliant deaf, Black, queer people who cannot be a part of this discourse, who just want to be a part of our communities and of our lives and of these conversations, but we do not provide them access. And I think that's another thing for all of us to start thinking about, that doing this work and having these conversations, and our young people who are thought leaders and our future thought leaders to really think about how we can start to bring more like, disabled, differently abled, and deaf people into these conversations.
For me,
No, seriously, I just want to honor that, right? People who organize this event.
Oh. Okay. So for me, L, definitely, I agree with what L had to say in terms of surrounding yourself, in terms of divesting, and surrounding yourself and aligning yourself with the folk that you that think like you. And so for me, that's been some of the things that I've been doing, joining TWOCC, aligning myself within the community more, taking steps to actually leave my job, which I've been with for 11 years. And not out of a place of privilege, not out of a place of I think I'm better. It was because I had to survive, right? We all have to survive and fit within that system. So that was my tool of survival. I like that you brought that up earlier. Shay, that was for me, that spoke to me because that is my tool of survival right now. But I also recognize that I'm complicit in that. And so for me, not only am I complicit, but then this trauma. We have all this trauma going on. Who wants to be surrounded by trauma and by oppression every day? And so for me, I've taken that step. So to answer your question, I have taken that step to remove myself from these systems and to actually be in the movement 24/7. So we'll see.
Yeah, thank you for that. I guess just a few points. One of the things so the rule of thumb is many of us critique systems in which we are part, or that we're in. So I love this notion of like being able to sort of map where we're located in that system. I always laugh. I have a lot of friends who have a lot of range. They're on a range, like a sort of spectrum when it comes to politics. You have folk who are, hardcore prison abolitionists sitting next to folk who see indictment of, say, officers who kill folk without impunity, indictment in jail as a possible means of justice. So for me, it's like making space for different tactics and strategies, and sometimes we hierarchize that such that when we're in like progressive movement spaces, if you vote, you're not really down. You're not really radical. Because a really radical, what does radicality mean? So we use words like radical as if we all know what that means, as if we all know what that, and I think this is this, so I don't know if this, I'm trying to get to an answer by saying that before I even imagine or reimagine, and I want to say that, since I use this word, that imagination is necessary. Black imagination is necessary for thinking about a future that's different than the present that we live in. But if we are going to change and invent something that's new, we need to know what the systems are that we're trying to work against. And we also need to we need to unpack these rhetorics that we use. So what does justice mean?
Right.
What does radical revolution mean? Radical revolution for one person might be destruction of all prisons. For somebody else, it might be rethinking what rehabilitative carceral practices look like. For somebody else, it could be voting, because they understood what the history, the genealogy of voting rights was for black folk. For somebody else, it may be anarchy and disconnection from the state, despite the fact that you're still in the state. Like, so there's all these questions that I think we need to have. And I think the hubris that's attached to the type of ways in which we come with these sort of visions that's conceptualized as an individual or within small collectivities, as opposed to like having these conversations in larger rooms like this, where we really begin to see that we all don't mean the same thing when we say some of these words. For somebody else, revolution is taking up arms. For another person, nonviolent resistance is the way forward. So I am going to say, for me, I am interested in having asking these questions and having those type of conversations, and in a collectivity, reimagining a world together.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think if I were to add something, I think certainly we need to implement political education within our framework. I think certainly, as Darnell kind of touched on, in order to be able to deconstruct anything, you have to have a knowledge of what that thing is. And I think, and I don't mean political education academy to the ground, that even that language is problematic, but what I'm talking about is us having real conversations about how white supremacy is enacted in our community. So that means actually sitting down, thinking about what stores are coming in, what peoples are coming in, how gentrification is happening, how people don't have jobs, don't have access to food, listening to people who may not have the degree, who may not be able to talk in the sophisticated social justice language that we praise, when really most people without the degrees have the real analysis. So I think we need to get rid of the elitism that finds its way within movement spaces, because that is also an act of violence. And I think we need to be careful and mindful about the ways we criminalize people who have a GED, criminalize people who can't talk the fancy Harvard language. And we need to actually be very mindful. Like if we think about the welfare rights movement, that was led by all people who did not have education, who did not have access to jobs, to the academy, but they found a way to mobilize in ways that were new, that were transgressive, if you will, and that were able to imagine a better future for black people. So I just want us to be mindful about elitism. It's so deadly in these spaces.
I just want to echo my sisters, because when we talk about what our collective liberation looks like, I'm taken back to what my grandmother would tell me when I was a kid. Like, when kids wouldn't want to share their toys with you, or didn't want to, or were playing rough with you, like, just avoid those kids. You're like, you don't have to play with them. You don't have to share with them if someone's not treating you properly, or how you want to be treated. And for me, like, I want to play with people who want to play with me. I want to share my toys with people who want to share toys with me. As a child, as an adult, I want to work with people who understand the analysis and also have the praxis, and who is ready to engage at this level. I also want to work with people who are going to understand the violence that we face every day, and not going to be stuck up in their feelings when they're being held accountable. It's really, really challenging, especially for Black trans women, to be in these collective spaces, because we are not even acknowledged as humans by the people who are in these spaces. So I really think it's important that we acknowledge that. You can't just say, oh, just come on, Black trans woman, and get into a group with people and pour out your soul. That's emotional labor. You have not paid me enough for that, nor do you have enough money to pay me for that type of labor. So I really think you should understand, like, the effort and energy it takes for us to sit up here and talk about our lives and expose our lives, even as it's being live streamed. Once again, as Black trans women, we could be murdered simply for being Black trans women. And so you really should really value that when we're in a space. And understand we don't even have to be in this space, because it puts us in jeopardy, not just from violence outside of the space, but even violence inside of the space. And that's really something that we have to acknowledge if we want to really move forward with collective healing, and particularly if you want to have Black trans women in the space. So, Ashe. Let's take one more question. I know y'all didn't like that one. Y'all like to be held accountable. It's okay.
One more.
Yes.
Joshua.
Thank you. I don't think I need a mic. I can get pretty loud. One thing that I kind of want to bring, I want to thank all of you guys first, just for like bringing like yourselves and opening up, right, in this space. One thing that I kind of want to evoke here is praxis, right? I think that's something you teased out really beautifully earlier, Lourdes. And so I think a lot of our conversations, oftentimes in academic spaces and otherwise, are framed around whiteness, right? And we talk about white supremacy, but then we choose to use our tongues to then reenact that, right? So we talk about white narratives, right? We talk about like white people, but like vilifying us, right? We talk about like how black people are doing the work of the white man by killing us, right? And I really want to subvert that. I think it's important to subvert that, right? And so moving away from theory and working with that practice, I'm really fascinated in ways that we could work with our own communities, right? All of us are black. Right? And even if it is black, okay, still black. Even if it is black people who may oftentimes be killing other black people, right? Black people who are killing other trans people. What ways do we not frame this conversation about whiteness and white supremacy? How do we move it to our own communities and work with ourselves, right? I'm interested in like ways, tangible ways that we can do that.
Lord, taking one more question too, just two at once. Is that okay?
Of course. Got it.
This one or
we can do two at once, or
that's a lot.
Separate.
Yeah.
Thank you, Katrina.
Yeah.
Oppression. Okay. Responses to Joshua. Yeah, I think it's important. And I agree. Oftentimes we start framing these conversations around racism or white supremacy as our relationship to whiteness and white people. I personally feel that the way white supremacy shows up within our communities, and all black communities, is through racialized misogyny. And so this gets back to my point earlier that I think the way we can really start having these conversations within our communities is really starting to think about violence, violent misogyny, violent masculinity. The violence of masculinity, how it's inherited, how it shows up in our communities. I think it's really important. And also to start thinking about how we embody, how we internalize white supremacy. A lot of people are not challenging themselves around these ideas of how white supremacy shows up in their everyday lives all the time, just from little things. Like I had a buddy of mine one day tell me, this black guy, and I was showing him my tattoos or something. And he was like, oh, I don't have any tattoos. And I was like, well, why not? And he was like, well, because, I don't want white people to think a certain way about me. It's already bad enough that they're already scared of us because I'm a black man. And I'm thinking to myself, man, if you were on a train, this white lady next to you is scared, then bitch, boogity boo, be scared. Be scared. You know what I'm saying? But, right, so there's that. The next step is, the next question is, why was that the first place you went to when you thought about how you expressed yourself as a masculine person, as a black man? Why was that your first thing, saying, I'm not going to do this because I don't want white people to feel fucked up about my presence instead of I want to challenge their own racism. You understand what I'm saying? So I think that's critical for us, and I've had to do it. A lot of us have to do it. Like, if you're going to occupy these spaces, you have to deconstruct so many things. I personally have to deconstruct, constantly internalize, white supremacy that's in my life and have to weed it out. I gotta shit it out. You understand what I'm saying? Seriously. When I'm thinking about the sexism and the misogyny that I do embody now as a trans man, even though I've been able to live in the world, as a man and as a woman and being able to see these different things, there's ways in which misogyny is in the culture and it just creeps into you. It really does. And if you're not really taking the deliberate steps to really deconstruct it and recognize it, you can really fall victim to it. So I think that's the most important thing for us to really start questioning these things that we embody.
And I just want to say quickly, also, not only do we need to have these conversations in our community, we also need to have them in our own families. What are we actively doing in our own families to have these conversations? With your mom, with your sister, with your brother. I've had a family member on Facebook I had to remove because they were sharing a video of a trans woman being attacked here in New York. And when I questioned him, it was like, it's my page. What you want to do about it? You're right. Delete. I have no problems and qualms with that. So for me, it's important that we start the healing, we start divesting, we start all of that within our own homes. Who are we holding accountable in our homes? Who are we holding accountable in your bed?
It's no longer about the date. It's about the analysis.
Okay. Not all one thing. All one thing.
I had a friend tell me, she was like, I sleep with him, but he's white, but he has an analysis. And I'm like, okay. Rationalization. It makes sense.
I think it's another question.
One more question, God's child.
Okay, so question. And again, kudos to the panel because you guys have really educated and informed and created a space that's absolutely wonderful, and you just opened me up to so many possibilities. So, as we all go forward in this possibility factor, i.e. Darnell, how do we make room for those of us who are trying to figure it out? One. Two, even in our challenging, protesting, and being upset and all the rest of that, how do we speak on those people without becoming those people? Thank you.
Brother Darnell?
She did say your name.
Oh, you right there.
I know. Because I love God. That's my friend. Part of, if I think about myself and the way in which I've come to sort of political consciousness, which is every day, I think in so many ways, when I know a thing, it makes, I lack patience for others who are still on their way. Does that make sense?
It does.
Without thinking about, even as a queer identified person, the way in which heteronormativity worked itself out on me so much. Let me use different words. The way in which, even as a person, a male identified person who was engaging sex with other males, I understood myself in those moments to be doing something. I thought I was doing something innately sinful, wrong. Like I just didn't love myself, even while this is so. If I remember that political consciousness raising for me is something that occurred every single day, like I had to come into some recognition of a lot of things, the way that people responded to me because of my gender expression, or the fact that I got a beard and that I performed and comported and moved my bodies in different ways. I also have to be very patient, while at the same time engaging folk in a very critical, generous way. With them too. So the way that this gets tricky, right? Because I think the only time we're ever really asking for that, when we think about white racial supremacy, there's like no patience. Like we think that white people, you need to get it right now. Like this is where, and this is Lourdes to your point that I wanted to raise. I do think that there is a way that we will allow like righteous rage to show up when we can name like racism. Not so much when we're naming trans misogyny, sexism, and so much else, right? So even with that, I do know that there's how do we create space for people to come to consciousness? And that's a question. That's not even the answer. I started with myself because space was provided for me. I mean, I had many people to come along who told me when I was doing some shit that was wrong. Who helped me to think differently. So many folk who have provided me with language and books and just life experiences. So for me now, I'm thinking, how do we create those spaces to do the same now in ways that don't let people off the hook, but also allow space for them to come to understandings and to change. To actually do some self-reflexive work, not just analysis, but actually real life, tangible change, like in their lives, giving some shit up, giving power up, and how do we make space for that? So I'm responding to your question with a question, because I'm still trying to figure that out.
I definitely agree with Darnell. I think also though I agree, I think sometimes being patient can induce an emotional labor that becomes violent towards oneself. So as much as I want to be patient with folks who are around me, who are still growing and learning, Sometimes you have to leave those Facebook threads, like Katrina talked about, and sometimes you have to leave the Thanksgiving table and go take care of yourself, because some people just don't want to do better, and some people choose to believe the things that they believe. And I think Elle pointed that out perfectly, that you have to surround yourself with people that want to do this work. And we there's room at the table, right? There's room at the table if you want to come aboard, but we don't have time to be inflicting ourselves with all the pain and trauma over and over and over and over again. It's exhausting.
Katrina?
I told y'all the average age of the black trans women that were murdered. So, like, we don't have time to wait. Right. And that's just the reality. I think we have to really be intentional about making sure that marginalized voices are a part of every conversation that we engage in. Because a lot of people have the privilege to engage in a lot of conversations, but with your privilege, you don't get to just speak about marginalized people if you're not actively saying, you know what, this is somebody that you should be talking to. And so I think with the privilege that people have in the movement, that's something that you should be taking complete advantage of.
I've said many times, like, I'm not the one-on-one engagement type person. So, like, I only choose to work with 1s and 2s and some 3s, right? I don't do the 4s and 5s because it's a complete waste of my time, not someone else's, but of mine. Because I have owned my role in the movement, and I'm comfortable with that role in the movement. And I'm not here for basic engagement. I'm 39 years old, which means I'm already on borrowed time as a black trans woman. So I have no time to deal with you learning what trans means. I need you to Google, right? I need you to go talk to your other friends who are ready for the one-on-one engagement, because that's not my role in the movement. My role in the movement is to build more warriors to fight this fight that we're fighting, and to also empower them to enjoy life while they can, while they're still here. So it's not for me to teach you about trans people, to teach you about genitals, to teach you about all these basic things. It really should be about your concern. What we should be learning about and focusing on is the humanity in all of us, because we all are human and we all deserve a right to breathe. And so, like, for me, I don't have to engage with you. I can remember out of the 39 years of my life, no cis person ever created a space for me. No cis person ever held me and told me it's going to be all right. I'm going to help you. So for you to now turn around and tell me that I now have to create space for you, for you to tell me, be patient with me as I work through my cis privilege, as I work through my white privilege. That's an option. You get to tap out. We don't get to tap out of this work. This work is our lives, and like, we're fighting for our lives. We're organizing for our lives. We are fundraising for our lives, right? The work that we do directly impacts us, so it means a lot to us. And so we don't get to just like tap out. You know, we do get to take time for self-care, collective self-care, but that's far and few in between. So I think it's important that in the work that I do, I make sure I work to create spaces for other trans women of color to live unapologetically in their truth. When I speak, I'm making sure like there is space for those trans people of color who are undocumented, who have disabilities, who are not included in the space because of for whatever reason. You know, I recognize what people want to consider privilege that I may hold for whatever reason. And so I use that privilege or access to make it possible for other people like me to also to continue this work. Because like I said, I'm 39, I'm on borrowed time, and I don't plan to do this for too much longer. I want to be like Tina. I want to go get a house by the sea, have a husband and some children and a family. All right, I want to be like Tina Turner, right? Go away somewhere and live life, or go be on a farm somewhere. You know, I don't want to fight for my life the rest of my life. Oh wait, I'm not going to fight for my life any more longer, right? And so we can't keep fighting. The onus is on you, on the people in this room, to do something with your lives besides thinking about yourself and think about other people who may not have the access that you have. And we all have some access. We in this room. You know, this room should be full of Black trans women. And we need to also think about why they're not here. What does access really look like? You know, there are people who don't have subway fare to get here from their homes. There are some of us who don't even have homes. So also thinking about the space that we occupy, even when we're having these very elitist conversations, because that's what it is. This is not in a community center in Brooklyn. This is in the middle of Manhattan. So also thinking about the impact that has on the Black community, on the Black trans community, when we're talking about access and creating spaces for those who are not part of the conversation. I don't know if this is really part of the question, but I just wanted to say this. So this is really heavy. A lot of this conversation that's being here, it's heavy, it's tiring. There's a lot of doing, and we constantly talk about doing the work and the work and going and doing and changing people's minds. But I also just want everybody to understand that sometimes being is doing. Sometimes just existing and embodying is doing, because not everybody can do. Right, we can all do differently. There are a lot of people who are differently able to, can't do, but are still a part of the movement. So sometimes movement does look like that. And also, you know, this is a lot of work. And, you know, self-care is self-preservation. You know, sometimes, you know, me and my wife have this conversation all the time. I'm home and I'm just like chilling, playing Xbox, eating chicken, and I'm like, you know, I need to be doing something. I need to be doing something. And you know, and she's had to constantly tell me, like, you know, you do enough. Like, stop. You know, and this is what Black people do. Like, let me tell you, okay, so my mom, let me just, and I'm gonna wrap this up. Okay, I just lost my mother over some of the breast cancer, God rest her soul. But my mom, she would go to work for 2 years and never miss a day. I remember one time for 2 years she didn't miss a day at work. She was never late. And she was so proud of just watching all her time accumulate. She just loved it, right? But I think this workhorse idea has been hammered into Black people. Like, if you are not producing, if you are not contributing, if you are not going, then you are not valuable. And I think that's something else that we really need to start thinking about. And when we talk about changing and divesting, let's divest from this idea of constantly doing and producing, because sometimes just being, sometimes sitting just in your skin, you know, is your contribution. So I just want to say that to all of us here, you know, take time out, chill in your drawers and eat some chicken.
Absolutely, I think that's why it's so important that we need to divest from these structures. Because it's hard to do that when you got rent to pay. So, and I say that only to say because I've taken time off away from work to take care of my family and take care of myself the last several weeks. And I've noticed that change of just being in a place where I can just wake up and not have to like perform.
Yes, honey.
And it's beautiful.
Oh yeah.
Paycheck, I miss. But it's beautiful. And so that kind of just, that nuance, just being able free to not have to like worry about putting on this uniform and perform this role and just be myself and think, and to actually be able to just think and ask questions. I can't do that if I'm...
Yeah, right.
Exactly. And so that, I think that's helping me realize where I need to be in my role in movement.
Absolutely. Every breath a Black trans person takes is an act of revolution. So if we don't do another damn thing, not a nada, we have done enough just by simply breathing and existing. Every breath a genderqueer person of color takes is an act of revolution. Every breath we take, you know, is an act of revolution, and that's something that we really need to understand. And if we never do nothing else in our lives, every person on this panel has done enough. Let's give them a round of applause. Make yourself a round of applause. No one ran out crying. Nobody got their edges snatched. Thank you so much.
And we have another round of applause for the panel. Awesome. So hi, my name is Robert Taylor Jr. I work at the NYU LGBTQ Center, and I do some things there, yeah? So I just wanted to say how absolutely delicious this panel was. I enjoyed it, guys. I think that it gave us all the chance to reflect on the Black Lives Movement matter,
whoa, no, I messed that up. The Black Lives Matter movement. And then to also see how the trans community is included and is not included in that movement. And then to also think about mobilization around the Black community and what we can do as a people. And then also to talk about privilege and how it's exerted and excreted and spewed and thrown on people. And then also as a historian, because you know I'm a baby, of gender and sexuality and looking at how gender and sexuality are performed and expressed in societies, and then seeing how historically delicious the context was that the panelists were constantly referencing history. I think I heard history about like 55 times, I was counting. And that history is important. So at this time, I'd like to thank the wonderful people for coming out. You look so beautiful. I'd like to thank our panelists for coming and blessing us with all the knowledge. And then the NYU LGBTQ Community Center, Student Center here at NYU. Our co-sponsors, the Center for Multicultural Education and Programs. The Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, and the Africana Studies Program in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis. Awesome. So at this time, we're going to take some photos. I'm just going to ask that you let the panelists shine for a couple of seconds, and then let the panelists and staff do some things, and then you can take pictures next to your idols, okay? I don't know, are you listening? I mean, you can stay and watch if you want. But thank you for coming.
I'm hungry.
I'm ready for this good dinner.
I'm hungry, so I'm ready to go. Okay. We headed to David's? Okay. I'm not mad.
I need to smile. I need my phone. Girl, stop letting me talk.
Sexy baby. Oh, you're so smart.
See what I'm saying?
Yes.
Oh my God.
It's a good meal.
Ebony, Ryan.
So nice to meet you. No, but I mean like. I get out with Audrey Lourdes and some bells. Black women's breathing was on the panel tonight.
Some of the things you're saying. Breathe the breath of Black
people that rush back and get oh, where? I don't know if you can answer. What's the deal with
Oh, you're gonna walk in front of their picture. Yeah, I on the black note. Ready? I know, it's too much.
Yes. We'll give out a couple cards.
Somewhere.
Yeah, your face is
Millions March?
No, I wasn't at the Millions March. I was Millions March DC.
No, I know.
Rockaway tattoo.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, we've seen each other before. Yeah.